New York City, 1908. Stand at the Battery on a clear May morning and look north along Broadway. Among the accumulated stone and brick of Lower Manhattan, one structure detaches itself from the skyline with an almost unseemly confidence. A slender tower rising 612 feet, its upper shaft clad in brick and terracotta, its crown a gilded wrought iron lantern catching the harbor light, like something lit from within. The New York Times, covering the dedication on the 1st of May, called it a monument to American industrial genius. The description was accurate and insufficient. What stood at 149 Broadway was not merely an engineering achievement, but a declaration, corporate identity pressed into steel and stone, funded by 10 million sewing machines sold to the households of the world. It was the tallest habitable structure on Earth. In 1968, by deliberate choice, it became the tallest building ever. Demolished. Frederick Gilbert Bourne did not inherit his position. He constructed it the way a careful man constructs anything of lasting value, methodically, with attention to materials, and with a clear understanding of what the finished thing must communicate to those who see it. Born in Connecticut in 1851, Bourne entered the Singer Manufacturing Company as a young man of modest background and rose through its ranks across 3 decades with the patient determination of someone who understood that corporations, like empires, reward those who learn their internal languages before attempting to speak their own. By 1889, he was the company's 5th president, and the title was not the end of his ambitions, but merely the platform from which he intended to launch them. What Bourne wanted, what he had always wanted, with a clarity that distinguished him from ordinary corporate ambition, was transformation. He wished to pass from the category of successful businessman into something older, something that American democracy officially denied, but culturally accommodated: aristocracy. The evidence is not speculative. In 1899, Bourne purchased Indian Neck Hall on Long Island, a Gilded Age estate of staggering scale, its grounds sweeping toward the water in the manner of an English country house transplanted to Long Island Sound. Around the same period, he commissioned construction of Dark Island Castle on the St. Lawrence River in New York, a structure built in the manner of a Scottish baronial fortress, complete with turrets and a drawbridge. The architectural vocabulary chosen for both properties was unmistakably European, unmistakably aristocratic, unmistakably the language of a man who had decided that American commerce, having made him wealthy, would now be made to make him noble. These acquisitions were not expressions of eccentricity. They were a coherent strategy, and they illuminate the psychology that would eventually produce the Singer Tower. Bourne was a man who understood that identity is architectural, that you build what you wish to become, and that buildings, more reliably than almost any other form of self-expression, communicate status across distances that words cannot bridge. A man may claim to be important. A castle on a river insists upon it. And in this understanding, Bourne was perhaps more perceptive than his critics have allowed, because he grasped something that the Gilded Age instinctively practiced but rarely articulated. In a society without inherited titles, architecture performs the function that heraldry performs in older cultures. It marks, it announces, it endures. The commission for what would become the Singer Building emerged from this same psychology. Bourne's directive to architect Ernest Flagg, preserved in internal Singer Company memoranda of the period, was specific in its ambition, if not its technical particulars. The building must, he wrote, express permanence and distinction. Not efficiency, not economy, not the rational provision of office space for a growing corporation. Permanence and distinction. The two qualities that aristocracy claims as its exclusive property and that new money perpetually attempts to acquire through expenditure of sufficient scale. Bourne did not want a functional headquarters. He wanted a monument, and he wanted it to be seen. It is worth pausing here to consider the precise nature of that desire, because it contains within it the first seeds of what would eventually become the building's tragedy. Monuments, by definition, are built to outlast their builders. They are statements addressed to the future, declarations that something, a dynasty, a corporation, an idea, was here and mattered. But monuments are also fundamentally expressions of a particular historical moment's vanity, and vanity, unlike stone, ages poorly. What reads as magnificent aspiration in one era reads, in another, as overreach. Bourne's directive to build for permanence and distinction assumed a world in which the terms of permanence and distinction would remain stable, in which what impressed in 1908 would continue to impress in 1968. It was an assumption that the 20th century would systematically dismantle. Bourne's personal fortune by the turn of the century exceeded $5 million, a figure of genuine consequence in an era before income tax, before inflation had compressed the psychological weight of such numbers. He was a rich man by any honest measure, yet he understood, with the accuracy that occasionally accompanies obsessive social observation, that personal fortune and corporate monument were different instruments producing different effects. His estates were private statements, visible only to those invited to see them. A tower at the corner of Broadway and Liberty Street would be visible to everyone, to arriving immigrants in the harbor, to competitors in neighboring buildings, to the city's newspapers, and the world's architectural press. The tower was not a place for Bourne to live. It was a place for Bourne to be seen, which is to say, it was a place for Singer to be seen. And in 1908, before the corporation's identity had fully separated from its presidents, those two things felt like the same. Bourne would step down from the presidency in 1905, 3 years before the tower's completion. The monument he commissioned would be finished in his absence, inhabited by successors, and eventually demolished 49 years after his own death in 1919. The story of the Singer Tower is, in this sense, the story of what happens when ambition outlives the ambitions that created it, when the monument continues to stand after the intention that justified its construction has quietly dissolved. Ernest Flagg arrived at the Singer Commission already convinced of something that most architects of his generation were not, that the skyscraper, as it was then being built in American cities, was an aesthetic and civic problem requiring principled opposition. Flagg was Paris-trained, a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts, and he carried back from France not merely a vocabulary of ornamental forms, but a set of convictions about what buildings owed to the streets and cities they occupied. Those convictions would shape the Singer Tower from its foundation to its gilded crown, and they would also, in ways neither Flagg nor Bourne could have anticipated, contribute to the building's eventual obsolescence. The core of Flagg's argument, articulated most fully in an essay published in the Architectural Record in 1908, the year of the tower's completion, was that the skyscraper ought to be composed of 3 legible parts: a base, a shaft, and a crown. A tripartite. Grammar borrowed from the classical column and adapted to the demands of a structure that might rise 40 stories into the sky. The base should relate to the street, providing pedestrian scale and commercial vitality. The shaft should rise with restraint, occupying only a portion of the available lot, rather than expanding to consume every square foot of rentable space. And the crown should resolve the building's vertical ambition into an architectural terminus, something that completed the upward movement rather than simply stopping it where economics dictated. This was not merely aesthetic preference. Flagg believed, with the earnestness of a reformer, that his 3-part model offered a practical solution to what was already becoming the defining visual problem of Manhattan: the canyon street, dark and narrow, produced by towers that rose as massive vertical blocks from lot line to lot line, blocking light and air, turning pedestrian experience into a perpetual transit through artificial shadow. His own tower, he argued, demonstrated what responsible ambition looked like. The Singer shaft rose 612 feet but occupied only approximately 25% of the available lot, leaving the surrounding streets relatively open to light. The Beaux-Arts ornament was not applied decoration but the logical completion of a formal argument. Each element of the French Renaissance vocabulary placed where classical training said it should be placed, no more, no less. The specifics of the design were correspondingly precise. The tower's facade was clad in brick and terracotta, its surface articulated with the characteristic Beaux-Arts combination of flat planes and sculptural relief, pilasters and cornices marking the vertical rhythms that Flagg's education had taught him to value. The roofline of the lower building concluded in a mansard of green copper, a reference to the great French Second Empire buildings that Flagg had studied on the Au, Boulevard Haussmann, and the streets around the Palais Royal. Above the mansard, the tower shaft rose through its upper stories with increasing slenderness until it arrived at the lantern. The wrought iron cupola, gilded, octagonal, its form derived from the domed pavilions of French Baroque architecture and adapted to the requirements of a building that needed its crown to be legible from harbor distances. Flagg had not been Bourne's inevitable choice for the commission. He had been a deliberate one. Bourne wanted distinction, and distinction in 1900, New York required an architect of established reputation who could credibly promise that the result would not embarrass its patron aesthetically. Flagg, trained in Paris, associated with the prestige architecture of the American Renaissance, was precisely that architect. The relationship between them was the characteristic Gilded Age relationship between patron and architect, money providing the ambition, training providing the form, and the resulting building serving as the public expression of a private negotiation between what could be afforded and what ought to be shown. Steel arrived at the site throughout 1906 and 1907, hauled from Bethlehem Steel's Pennsylvania mills, and transferred to Manhattan via rail and barge, then lifted by crane in sections that required specialized rigging equipment and crews experienced enough to work at heights that would have been considered industrial suicide a generation earlier. The Singer Company's annual reports for the construction period record the expenditure in terms carefully chosen to communicate investment rather than cost. The distinction matters because Bourne and his successors understood that the price of the building would be judged differently if it was framed as capital expenditure rather than corporate indulgence. This was financially accurate. It was also strategic communication, and it illustrates how thoroughly the distinction between monument and office building had been collapsed in the institutional thinking that surrounded the project. The structural system was steel cage construction. By 1907, the established technology for buildings of this height and ambition, a grid of vertical columns and horizontal beams, shop fabricated and field connected by teams of ironworkers who worked without the safety equipment that later generations would consider elementary, formed the building's skeleton. Around this skeleton, the elaborate Beaux-Arts skin was assembled. Brickwork in the lower stories, terracotta ornament at every floor. The mansard's copper framing built up piece by piece until the green roof emerged above the financial district's roofline, like something transplanted from a Parisian arrondissement. The lantern crown required specialized ironworkers brought in for its fabrication and assembly, men whose craft was not structural engineering, but ornamental metalwork. The kind of skill that the late 19th century had developed in abundance and the early 20th century would begin to make redundant. What it physically meant to build the world's tallest building in 1908 cannot be fully recovered from the documentary record, but the outlines are legible. Working days extended from early morning until failing light 6 days a week. The height itself created conditions that did not exist at lower floors. Wind loads that affected both workers and the materials they were handling. temperature differentials that made steel behave differently at 300 feet than at street level, and a psychological dimension to the work that went unrecorded in corporate documents, but was surely present in the consciousness of every man who bolted a beam at the tower's upper stories. The Singer Company's construction records refer to the workforce largely in aggregate terms, as numbers rather than individuals, which was the documentary convention of the era and also its limitation. We know the building was erected, and we know approximately how long it took and how much it cost, but the human texture of the construction process survives only in fragments. The facade's terracotta ornament, manufactured to Flagg specifications at facilities in New Jersey and delivered to the site in precisely dimensioned pieces, required fitting by skilled masons whose ability to read an architect's drawings and translate them into three-dimensional surface was among the highest-paid craft skills in the New York construction industry of the period. Every pilaster capital, every cornice molding, every decorative panel in the French Renaissance vocabulary was a small individual commission, requiring the judgment of a craftsman as well as the muscle of a laborer. This multiplication of skilled decisions, each ornamental choice requiring human evaluation rather than mechanical replication, was both what made the building beautiful and what made it expensive in ways that a later century, committed to efficiency and prefabrication, would find increasingly difficult to justify. When the Singer Tower was completed and formally dedicated in May of 1908, it held the world height record, a distinction it would retain for exactly 18 months before the Metropolitan Life Tower on Madison Square surpassed it in 1909. 18 months is a very short time to be the tallest building on Earth, and one could argue that this brevity prefigures the building's entire subsequent history, a thing of genuine achievement and genuine beauty, perpetually being outrun by the forces it had itself helped to set in motion. Every rivet driven upward at 149 Broadway was also, in a sense, a rivet driven into the logic of competition. And competition, once established as the primary idiom of American building, recognizes no completed argument, only the next target. The Singer Manufacturing Company did not merely sell sewing machines. It sold a transformation. The idea that a woman seated at home, her foot working a treadle, her hands guiding cloth beneath a needle, was participating in something modern, something industrial, something that connected her domestic interior to the largest commercial network the world had yet assembled. By 1908, Singer operated in every inhabited continent, maintained factories in New Jersey and Scotland, employed salesmen in villages across Russia, India, Brazil, and China, and produced over 2 million machines annually. The tower at 149 Broadway was not the beginning of this empire. It was its coronation. The moment a company that had spent half a century threading its way into the world's households decided to announce itself in stone and steel and gilded iron, visible from the harbor through which its own cargo moved daily. The sewing machine itself was not Singer's invention. Elias Howe had patented the lock-stitch mechanism in 1846, and Isaac Merritt Singer had refined it, litigated for it, and eventually formed the sewing machine combination, a patent pool that allowed the industry to coexist while Singer extracted licensing fees from competitors and plowed revenue back into manufacturing scale. What Singer invented, more than any particular mechanism, was the installment payment plan. By selling machines on credit, $1 down, $1 a month, Singer made industrial technology accessible to households that could not afford a lump sum purchase. The genius was not mechanical, but financial and psychological. Singer did not wait for customers to come to its product. It sent agents to their doors, demonstrated the machine in their kitchens, and left before they had fully decided. The machine already sitting in the corner, already threaded, already part of the room. This intimacy with the domestic sphere was the foundation of an empire that, by the turn of the century, had become something closer to a colonial infrastructure than a consumer goods company. Singer's global reach depended on networks of local agents, repair technicians, supply depots, and showrooms that penetrated markets where no other American company had established a permanent commercial presence. In Russia alone, Singer operated thousands of retail outlets and employed tens of thousands of agents. In Japan, in Egypt, in Argentina, the treadle machine arrived as simultaneously a labor-saving device and an ambassador of American industrial culture. The machine taught women to want efficiency, and it taught economies to want American goods, that the product was associated with femininity, with sewing, mending, and domestic production, did not diminish its imperial reach. It amplified it, because it bypassed the resistance that overtly military or extractive commercial enterprises often provoked. Singer arrived not with soldiers, but with thread. The irony folded inside the Singer Tower's existence was therefore structural, not incidental. The machine that built the tower was a tool associated with women's labor, with the needle, the thread, the domestic interior. The tower it funded was aggressively masculine in its ambition, vertical, public, competitive, visible from miles away. The women at their treadles in New Jersey tenements and Russian villages and Indian workshops were, in the most literal financial sense, paying for the gilded lantern crown that crowned a skyscraper none of them would ever enter. Singer's annual reports enumerated production figures with the pride of a general counting troops. 2 million machines in 1905 climbing year after year, each machine representing not merely a sale, but a recurring relationship, a need for replacement parts, for oil, for bobbin thread, for the company's own branded accessories. The domestic was made to generate the monumental. The needle was made to fund the tower. Ernest Flagg understood this, at least aesthetically. His building was not a factory. It was not a utilitarian container for office workers. It was a classical argument about what commercial power should look like when it aspired to permanence. The three-part composition he had developed: a broad base functioning as a commercial podium, a slender central shaft rising with aristocratic restraint, a crowned terminus that declared itself against the sky, was his translation of a company's character into architectural language. Singer was not merely large. Singer was refined, global, technically sophisticated. The building would not simply be tall, it would be articulate, and the lantern crown at its apex, gilded, wrought iron, illuminated at night by the newest electric technology available, was the flourish that transformed ambition into declaration. It could be seen from Brooklyn Harbor on a clear morning, catching the light before the streets below had fully warmed. It said, "We are here. We are permanent. We are the measure of this city's industrial intelligence." And every ship that moved beneath it, carrying Singer machines in its hold, passed under a crown that the machines themselves had paid to build. The race to own the Manhattan skyline did not begin with engineering. It began with envy. When the Tribune building rose to 260 feet in 1875, it was taller than any structure New York had previously permitted commerce to raise, and its height was noted in the press not as a technical achievement, but as a social one. A statement that journalism, or at least the enterprise behind journalism, had earned vertical expression. When the Manhattan Life Insurance Building surpassed it in 1894 at 348 feet, the language shifted from admiration to competition. The skyscraper was by then understood as a corporate identity instrument, a way of making a company's ambition visible to anyone who looked up, which in Lower Manhattan meant everyone, always. Ernest Flagg had strong feelings about what this competition was doing to the city, and he expressed them with the methodical precision of someone who believed his own aesthetic framework was objectively correct. In his 1908 essay published in the Architectural Record, He argued that the unchecked skyscraper, the kind that occupied its entire lot from sidewalk to setback and rose as high as the market would permit, was a civic disaster. It created canyon streets, blocked light, starved neighboring buildings of air, and transformed the sidewalk experience of Lower Manhattan into something between a tunnel and a trench. His solution was the slender tower. Restrict the building footprint to a fraction of the lot, allow the tower to rise freely above a substantial base, and crown it with a terminus that gave the skyline visual intelligence rather than mere accumulation. The Singer Tower was his argument made physical. The tower shaft occupied roughly 1/4 of the site's footprint, rising from a 10-story base building that filled the lot to a slender shaft climbing to 612 feet. By any measure of the era, this was radical restraint. His colleagues were not persuaded. Daniel Burnham, whose Flatiron building of 1902 had set the prevailing template for maximum lot occupation, thought Flagg's arguments were the aesthetic preferences of a Francophile dressed up as urban planning theory. Cass Gilbert, already designing the Woolworth building, which would surpass Singer's height by 1913, was building for permanence and practicality, a tower that could generate rental income across its full lot, floor after floor, without the expensive luxury of empty air and ornamental restraint. The marketplace agreed with Burnham and Gilbert. Slender towers were beautiful. They were also, in a real estate economy, inefficient. The floors you did not build were the rents you did not collect. The height competition between 1900 and 1910 was therefore a financial competition wearing an architectural disguise. The Metropolitan Life Tower surpassed Singer's record in 1909, reaching well over 700 feet and holding the world record until Woolworth displaced it in 1913. Each successive record was announced with press coverage that treated the height milestone as a civic achievement. The tallest building in the world, here in New York, evidence of American industrial supremacy, while the actual motivation was simpler. The taller the building, the more rentable floors, and the more a company could charge for the address and the prestige of altitude. The New York Tribune's architectural correspondent tracked the race with the attentiveness of a sports reporter following a championship season. Readers followed along, understanding that each new record was an argument about which corporation had most completely earned its place in the city's self-image. Singer held the world record for exactly 18 months. The Metropolitan Life Tower's completion in 1909 was not merely a technical supersession. It was a cultural one. Singer's slender shaft and gilded lantern were beautiful by any objective measure, but they were also expensive and inefficient, and efficiency was increasingly what New York rewarded. The new century was not hostile to beauty. It was indifferent to it in a way that was, in some respects, more damaging than hostility. The Canyon Street critics whom Flagg had been warning against did not lose the argument. They simply ignored it. Manhattan's skyline continued accumulating bulk and height according to the logic of the real estate ledger, and Flagg's Singer Tower stood among the new giants like a particularly well-dressed man at a competition where height and mass were the only criteria being judged. He was right about almost everything. He was simply not building the kind of right that changed minds. What remained, after the height race moved north and the tower settled into merely being tall rather than tallest, was the building itself. Its ornament, its crown, its presence in the lower Manhattan streetscape as a reminder that there had once been an argument about what skyscrapers were supposed to say. The argument was lost. The building was not yet. To enter the Singer Tower in 1908 was to understand immediately that this was not a building designed to be merely used. It was designed to be experienced, to produce in its visitors a specific interior sensation that Ernest Flagg and his clients at Singer Manufacturing had calibrated with the same precision a jeweler applies to a setting. The lobby was finished in marble, veined, polished, cold to the touch and warm to the eye, and it rose through the first floor with a height that had no functional justification. You did not need a 30-foot lobby ceiling to move people efficiently from the street to the elevators. You needed it to slow them down, to make them look upward, to produce the slight involuntary tilt of the head that signals awe. Before the mind has had time to manufacture a more composed reaction, Flagg built the lobby to perform a psychological operation on everyone who crossed its threshold, and contemporary accounts suggest it succeeded. The elevator cages were manufactured by the Otis Elevator Company, which by 1908 had become the definitive supplier of vertical transport for the city's skyward ambitions. But the cages in the Singer Tower were not merely functional enclosures. They were ornamental ironwork, the same decorative vocabulary that appeared on the building's exterior, translated into the intimate scale of an enclosure you stood inside while the city's floors descended or rose around you. The ironwork was gilded in places. The panels were detailed with motifs that echoed the building's French Renaissance vocabulary. To ride an elevator in the Singer Tower was to feel that the building extended its argument about beauty and permanence even into the mechanism of its own circulation. Nothing was merely structural. Everything was also a statement. The upper floors contained Singer's executive and administrative offices, and the company used the address with the deliberate care of an enterprise that understood brand identity before the term had been invented. Correspondence on Singer letterhead carried the building's address as a form of credibility, announcing to whoever received the letter that they were dealing with a company whose physical presence in the world's most commercially ambitious city was itself a guarantor of reliability. The address was the message. 149 Broadway meant something specific in 1908. It meant the tallest building in the world, the Gilded Crown, the harbor view, the company whose machines were in the homes of millions of people across the globe. To receive a letter from that address was to understand that Singer was not merely large. It was permanent. Near the building's summit, accessible by elevator and then a final stair climb, was the observation gallery housed within the lantern structure itself. Singer charged admission for access to this gallery, a decision that was simultaneously practical and philosophically revealing. The building had been built in one sense so that the city would look up at Singer, but Singer also offered the city the experience of looking out from Singer, and it extracted a fee for the privilege. The observation deck commanded a view of Lower Manhattan that in 1908 included no competing structures of comparable height, meaning the visitor standing in the lantern gallery could see in every direction a city that appeared to exist below them, below Singer specifically. The harbor was visible. Brooklyn was visible. The Hudson and the East River converged in the middle distance. On clear days, accounts suggest, the view extended to the New Jersey Highlands. People paid for this vision because it was, in the most literal sense, the Singer Company's gift to anyone willing to climb high enough and pay the admission price. A moment of seeing the world as Singer saw it from above. Frederick Gilbert Bourne signed the papers authorizing construction of the Singer Tower, and then, in 1905, 3 years before it was completed, resigned from the presidency of the Singer Manufacturing Company. The timing was not accidental. Bourne had spent 16 years transforming Singer from a successful industrial enterprise into a global commercial empire, and the transformation had cost him the particular kind of attention that a corporate presidency demands. He was 53 years old when he stepped down, and he had been building, simultaneously with the tower, another monument entirely. One that said something different about what he believed a life well lived should look like. Dark Island Castle, rising from a small island in the St. Lawrence River near Alexandria Bay, was Bourne's counter-argument to the Singer Tower. Where the tower was vertical and public and designed to be seen by millions, the castle was horizontal and private and designed to be inhabited by one family and their guests. Where the tower was a corporate declaration, the castle was a personal one. A statement that the man who had built the industrial empire had also earned the right to withdraw from it, to sit in a stone tower of his own on a river island and read and receive guests, and hunt and sail, and live at the pace of an English country gentleman, rather than a New York executive. Bourne had been purchasing the materials for this withdrawal throughout his tenure at Singer. Indian Neck Hall on Long Island, acquired in 1899, was the first large piece. Dark Island Castle, constructed through the early 1900s, was the completion. Together, they constituted an alternate biography, a parallel story of ambition, translated not into commerce, but into landed aristocracy, American style. The psychological complexity here is not difficult to locate. Bourne was the son of a New York merchant, educated without the European credentials that would have made his aristocratic ambitions legible to the transatlantic social world he was trying to enter. He compensated through acquisition of properties, of staff, of the visual vocabulary of English and Scottish landed nobility. The Singer Tower was part of this compensation. It was, in one reading, the monument that would justify everything else: the estates, the castle, the withdrawal from commerce. If the tower stood long enough and grandly enough, Bourne's name would be associated with it, and through it with a particular kind of American achievement that transcended mere wealth. Mere wealth was something thousands of Gilded Age fortunes could claim. The tallest building in the world was something else, except that the tower, once Bourne left Singer, ceased to be his. The company owned it, maintained it, and inhabited it, but the man who had commissioned it as his testament was no longer the man in the executive suite. His successor, James Bolton, occupied the office that would have been Bourne's, and the building settled into its institutional life as Singer's corporate headquarters, an identity separate from any individual patron's intentions. This is the inescapable logic of corporate architecture. It belongs to the institution, not the individual, and institutions are indifferent to biographical narrative. The Singer Tower was Singer's tower, and Singer would determine its fate according to criteria that had nothing to do with Bourne's wish for legacy. Bourne lived until 1919, long enough to see the Metropolitan Life Tower and the Woolworth Building surpass what he had commissioned, long enough to understand that the height record his building had briefly held was already historical rather than current, long enough to watch the center of Manhattan's commercial gravity migrate northward away from the lower Broadway district where the tower stood. He died at 67, at Dark Island Castle, in the private monument he had always preferred to the public one. His obituaries noted Singer's accomplishments. The tower was mentioned, his estates were mentioned. What was not mentioned, because it could not yet be known, was that the tower would stand for another 49 years after his death before being demolished, and that it would ultimately be better remembered for its destruction than for anything it contained or expressed during its operational life. The separation between patron and monument, between the man who commissions the building and the building's subsequent history, is one of architecture's most consistent patterns. Bourne imagined a legacy and departed before he could inhabit it. The legacy he had imagined became something else, a corporate asset, a streetscape feature, eventually a problem to be solved by a real estate developer with a spreadsheet. The castle on the river island survives today, a private residence, inhabited and maintained. The tower built to outlast everything Bourne owned is entirely gone. The private monument endured. The public one did not. There is a lesson in this about the relationship between scale and permanence, but it is not the lesson that the Gilded Age believed it was teaching. In the years immediately following the Singer Tower's completion, the city discovered something unexpected about the gilded lantern crown. It was most beautiful at night. The building's daytime presence was impressive, the slender shaft rising above the lower Broadway streetscape. The French Renaissance ornament catching afternoon light, the crown visible from the harbor and from the heights of Brooklyn. But it was the nocturnal illumination that captured the imagination of the city and its photographers. Electric light was still new enough in 1908 to carry a charge of wonder that later generations would lose the capacity to feel, and when Singer's lantern crown was lit against the night sky. The gilded ironwork throwing back the electric glow, the crown floating above the dark tower shaft like something detached from the solid city below. It produced in observers a response that the period's photographic record documents with unusual consistency. They kept returning to photograph it. They kept buying the postcards. The lit crown was an image that the city wanted to possess and could not stop reproducing. The Consolidated Edison Company supplied the current, and the supply contracts represent one of the more prosaic documents in the tower's archival history. Voltage specifications, load calculations. The clinical language of electrical engineering applied to a structure whose cultural function was anything but clinical. Singer's facilities, managers kept records of the illumination schedule, the maintenance requirements of the electrical fixtures, the periodic replacement of components in the crown's lighting array. The building that appeared in photographs as something magical was, from the inside of its own operations, a managed system of components and contracts, schedules, and invoices. This gap between the experience of a building and its operational reality is universal, but it seems particularly stark in the Singer Tower's case, where the lantern crown that photographers found inexhaustible was simultaneously an item on a maintenance checklist. The photographers themselves were working in a period when architectural photography was establishing its conventions, and the Singer Tower became, almost by default, one of the defining subjects of the form. The challenge of photographing a tall building from street level, the distortion, the foreshortening, the difficulty of capturing both the base and the crown in a single composition, was a technical problem that the Singer Tower posed with exceptional clarity. Its slender profile was actually easier to resolve than the broader Beaux-Arts towers, because the shaft's narrowness allowed the entire composition to fit within a tighter frame. Photographers, working from rooftops across Broadway or from the elevated vantage points of neighboring structures, found that the Singer Tower rewarded the attempt with an image that was compositionally complete. Base, shaft, crown, in a way that more massive contemporary structures did not permit. The photographs held. They circulated as postcards, as press illustrations, as the kind of architectural documentation that survives in archives long after the buildings themselves are gone. The nocturnal image became the emblematic one. A single archival photograph from roughly 1910, the gilded crown illuminated, the surrounding sky a deep, overexposed gray, the tower shaft falling away into the darkness below, concentrates in one image everything the Singer Tower meant to the culture that produced it. It is simultaneously a picture of power and of beauty, of commercial ambition and aesthetic refinement, of a city that believed it was building permanence and was actually, at that very moment, beginning to build the conditions for the tower's eventual obsolescence. The electric light that made the crown so beautiful was the same technology that would make the entire building seem outdated within decades. As electrical infrastructure, elevator technology, and structural engineering advanced and left the Singer Tower's systems progressively further behind the standards that new construction would establish. Night also had a practical function in the tower's commercial life. The lit crown was advertising, not in the explicit sense of a sign with text, but in the deeper sense of a visual identity so consistently repeated and so widely reproduced that it became the brand itself. When anyone in New York in 1912 thought of Singer manufacturing, they thought of the tower. And when they thought of the tower, they thought of the crown at night, burning above the harbor city. This was the goal of every corporate architectural commission of the Gilded Age, to transform a building into a persistent mental image, to make the company's physical presence so compelling that it became inseparable from the company's identity. Singer achieved this completely. The tower was Singer, and the crown was the tower. And at night, the crown was incandescent above the city that the company's machines had helped to furnish. The photographs survive. The crown does not. No institution claimed it when the demolition crews dismantled it in 1968. It was removed in pieces, like any obsolete industrial component, and the pieces were dispersed or discarded without ceremony. What remains is the image, the gilded light above the dark city, the crown that commerce built and commerce destroyed, glowing in archives that will preserve it long after everyone who ever saw the original has also gone. Singer Manufacturing Company was not collapsing in the 1920s. Not yet. The firm remained profitable, its machines still threading their way into households across 6 continents, its brand still carrying the peculiar authority of a product so ubiquitous it had become invisible. But the corporate structure that Frederick Gilbert Bourne had built, the one that had justified a tower as its terrestrial crown, was quietly reorganizing itself around different priorities. The administrative center of gravity drifted. Departments relocated. The tower that had been conceived as the physical embodiment of Singer's unified imperial identity became, floor by floor, a building that the company increasingly shared with tenants who had no connection to sewing machines whatsoever. This was not scandal. It was arithmetic. Office buildings must pay their costs, and costs do not pause to honor symbolism. The Depression arrived in 1929 and settled into lower Manhattan like a tenant who could not be evicted. Singer's financial records from the years 1929 through 1935 document a company fighting to preserve its margins against collapsing consumer spending, currency disruptions in key overseas markets, and the structural shock of a global economy that had reorganized itself overnight around survival rather than aspiration. The tower's occupancy rates, never again what they had been during the building's first decade, fell further. The ornate lobby, with its marble floors and gilded elevator cages, still received visitors, but fewer of them arrived with Singer business as their purpose. The building was becoming, by slow degrees, a real estate holding that happened to carry a famous name, which is precisely what happens when a monument outlives the singular intention that made it monumental. What the long decline of the Singer Tower reveals is not corporate failure, but the specific cruelty of architectural aspiration, built on a single moment's logic. Bourne had understood the Gilded Age perfectly. He had read its values with the precision of a man who had risen through its hierarchies by understanding exactly what was required. The tower was correct for 1908 in every particular. Its height, its ornamentation, its Beaux-Arts insistence on beauty as a form of authority, its gilded crown announcing that here was a company that could afford to light the sky. But the 20th century did not develop according to the logic of 1908. It developed according to its own catastrophes and reorganizations, its 2 world wars and its depression, its migration of commercial energy from the narrow streets of Lower Manhattan to the wider avenues of Midtown, its gradual preference for buildings that expressed efficiency rather than distinction. The Singer Tower had been designed to outlast a century. It turned out the century had no use for it. The decision to demolish the Singer Tower was not made in a single meeting, in a single year, by a single set of hands. It accumulated, as most irreversible decisions do, through a sequence of smaller choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation and catastrophic only when viewed together from the far end of the process. By the middle of the 1960s, the site at 149 Broadway had attracted the interest of United States Steel Corporation, which was in the process of planning what would become One Liberty Plaza, a building that would occupy a footprint incompatible with the survival of the Singer Tower, and that would deliver, by its developers' calculations, a return on investment the old building could no longer approach. The Singer Tower was not destroyed because anyone hated it. It was destroyed because the land beneath it had become more valuable than everything built upon it. The demolition permit was filed with New York City in 1967. The city's records from that year document the permit in the dry administrative language of municipal infrastructure, address, structure type, demolition method, contractor, with no notation acknowledging that the building in question was the tallest structure ever to be deliberately demolished in human history, that its gilded lantern crown had been photographed more than almost any other element of the early Manhattan skyline, that Ernest Flagg had designed it as a philosophical argument about restraint and proportion that the city had never adequately heard. Permits do not carry grief. That is someone else's department. The preservationist response was real, documented, and entirely unsuccessful. Organizations and individuals who understood what the Singer Tower represented, architecturally, historically, as a record of a specific moment in American commercial culture, filed formal protests, wrote letters, organized opposition, and spoke at public hearings. They argued that the building was irreplaceable, which was true. They argued that its destruction would constitute a permanent loss to the architectural heritage of New York City, which was also true. They argued that some accommodation might be found, some adaptive reuse, some structural integration into the new development that would allow at least the tower element to survive. The developers and the city listened to these arguments with the patient attention of institutions that have already decided, and the protests were noted and disregarded. Not a single ornamental element from the Singer Tower was preserved for a public collection. The marble was rubble. The terracotta ornamentation was debris. The gilded ironwork of the lantern crown, which had caught the morning light from Brooklyn Harbor for 60 years, was dismantled and disposed of without ceremony, without archive, without witness capable of preventing it. What lingers in the archival record from this period is not the arguments of the preservationists or the financial calculations of United States Steel. It is a single detail, documented in the coverage of the demolition announcement in the New York Times, regarding the lantern crown. A journalist noted that when representatives of several major museums were contacted regarding the potential salvage and donation of ornamental elements from the tower's exterior, the gilded ironwork, the terracotta panels, the decorative cornices, none of the institutions made a formal offer. The cost of disassembly, transport, and storage was prohibitive. The ornaments were large, fragile, and of a scale that made them difficult to exhibit. The museums, facing their own budgetary constraints, declined, and so the decision was made, without drama, that nothing would be saved. The lantern crown that had been assembled on site by specialized ironworkers in 1907 and 1908, that had been gilded and lit and photographed and painted and included in 1,000 postcards sold to 1,000 visitors to the observation deck, would be taken down in pieces and destroyed. This is what the spreadsheet looks like when it reaches its logical terminus. The demolition of the Singer Tower began in 1968 and proceeded with the methodical efficiency that large-scale destruction requires. It was not a single dramatic implosion, not the kind of theatrical collapse that crowds gather to witness and photographers position themselves to capture from a distance. It was instead the slower, less photogenic work of mechanical demolition. Cranes and wrecking equipment working floor by floor, dismantling from the top downward, the building diminishing by increments over weeks and months, until the site was clear and the foundation work for One Liberty Plaza could begin. The photographic sequence documenting this process, held in the Avery Architectural Library at Columbia University, shows the tower at various stages of reduction. The lantern crown gone first, then the upper floors, then the shaft, then the base. Each image a different answer to the question of how much is left. The lantern crown was the first significant element, removed, and its removal was the symbolic center of the demolition, even if no one formally acknowledged it as such. The crown had been, from the moment of the tower's completion, its most recognizable feature, the gilded iron cupola that terminated Flagg's classical argument about bases, shafts, and crowns, the element that caught the light, the element that appeared in every photograph and postcard and architectural drawing as the tower's defining gesture. To remove it was to decapitate the building before destroying the body, to eliminate the thing that had made the Singer Tower itself rather than merely another tall building on Broadway. Workers dismantled it in sections, the gilded ironwork coming apart in pieces that bore no resemblance, once separated, to the thing they had composed. No museum truck waited below. No conservator supervised the process. The pieces were loaded and removed, and their ultimate disposition is not documented in any archive that has since been located. The record that still stands, and that still carries a particular weight when stated plainly, is this: the Singer Tower is the tallest building ever deliberately demolished in human history. When it came down in 1968, no structure of comparable height had ever been intentionally destroyed. That record has not been broken in the more than half a century since. It may never be broken. Not because no taller building will ever be demolished, but because the combination of height, deliberateness, and the specific absence of any catastrophic necessity makes the Singer Tower's destruction a category of event that the architectural world has not been eager to repeat or surpass. The building was 612 feet tall. It held its height record for 18 months. It held its demolition record indefinitely. One Liberty Plaza, the building that replaced the Singer Tower on the site at 149 Broadway, was completed in 1972. It was designed by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill in the International style. A dark, rectilinear tower of steel and glass, 54 floors, occupying a full city block with the brute geometric confidence of a building that has made no decision about beauty because it does not consider beauty a relevant category. Architectural critics noted within years of its completion that it was oppressive in scale, hostile to pedestrians at street level, and representative of everything that had gone wrong with the corporate tower typology that Flagg had spent his career arguing against. The irony was noted at the time and has been noted repeatedly since. Ernest Flagg had believed with genuine conviction that if his approach to tower design, the slender shaft, the defined crown, the limited lot coverage, had been adopted as a model for Manhattan's development, the city might have developed a different and more habitable skyline entirely. Instead, the building that replaced his masterwork was precisely the kind of structure his masterwork had been designed to argue against. The city had demolished the argument and built the thing the argument opposed. The Avery photographic sequence ends with an image of the cleared site, the surrounding buildings momentarily visible in the gap where the Singer Tower had stood for 60 years. The surrounding streetscape looks disoriented, as cities always do when a familiar vertical element is suddenly absent. The way a face looks when a distinctive feature is removed. The surrounding proportions suddenly wrong without the thing that had organized them. The gap was temporary, of course. One Liberty Plaza would fill it soon enough, and within a decade the Singer Tower would be invisible, even as absence, its former presence erased by the mass of the building that had replaced it. The city does not preserve its gaps. It fills them, covers them, builds over them, and moves on. The only record that the Singer Tower stood at 149 Broadway for 60 years is photographic and archival. Drawings in the Avery Library, photographs in the Museum of the City of New York, the demolition sequence, the postcard record, the technical specifications. Everything else is One Liberty Plaza, which has no memory of what it replaced and was not designed to. What remains of the Singer Tower is not stone or steel, it is light. Specifically, the light captured in silver gelatin, albumen print, an early orthochromatic film by photographers who recognized, perhaps before Singer's own executives did, that the building was already becoming an image more durable than itself. The Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library at Columbia University holds Ernest Flagg's original drawings, elevation sheets rendered in ink so precise they seem less like construction documents than meditations on proportion. Every cornice line, every mansard curve, every bracket supporting the gilded lantern crown is present in those drawings, with a fidelity the physical building never quite achieved in its brief life. The Museum of the City of New York holds photographic negatives documenting the tower across more than 5 decades. Dawn shots, harbor panoramas, midnight exposures catching the lit crown against a sky that no longer exists above that particular longitude. A single structural fragment reportedly survived into the 1970s before disappearing from archival record entirely. No major American museum mounted a salvage effort before demolition. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, established in 1965, was 3 years old when the permits were filed. Too young, too underfunded, and too focused on still-standing losses to intercept one already scheduled for removal. The institutional machinery that might have preserved a lobby column, an elevator cage panel, or a section of the lantern framework simply had not yet developed the reflexes demolition required. So the building passed from mass to image without ceremony, and image is now all that remains. There is something philosophically instructive in this passage. Architecture that no longer stands cannot disappoint. It cannot be renovated badly, retrofitted clumsily, or surrounded by structures unworthy of its company. The Singer Tower, preserved only in photographs and drawings, exists now in a condition of permanent idealization, frozen at its best angle, in its most flattering light, always 1908, always newly crowned, always briefly, the tallest habitable structure on Earth. Stone decays, brick spalls, steel corrodes, but the image of the lantern crown against a harbor sky does not corrode. It does not require maintenance. It costs nothing to heat. In losing the tower entirely, architecture gains something photographs can offer that buildings never can: the abolition of entropy. Architectural schools study the Singer Tower with a frequency disproportionate to its brief dominance. Flagg's 3-part tower theory, base, shaft, crown, each legible and distinct, reads now as a road not taken, a formal argument that lost the debate to bulk zoning and the economics of floor plate repetition. Students encounter the tower not as nostalgia but as proposition that skyscrapers were once conceived as classical arguments, that restraint was once considered a form of structural courage, that a building could be the slenderest possible version of its own ambition and still reach the sky. The drawings in the Avery Library function as a kind of ghost curriculum, teaching through absence what the present city teaches through presence. What stands around us now argues one position. What the Singer drawings propose argues another. The argument is unresolved. The drawings are patient. There is a certain kind of American story that ends with the thing built being surpassed by the thing that replaced it. The Woolworth Building outlasted Singer. One Liberty Plaza, which removed Singer from the skyline, was criticized within a decade of completion as everything the tower it replaced was not. Graceless, indifferent to the street, optimized entirely for rentable square footage. The irony is almost mechanical. The building demolished for being economically obsolete was replaced by one aesthetically inadequate. The spreadsheet won the argument but lost the aesthetic case. And the gilded lantern crown, that wrought iron cupola assembled on site by specialized ironworkers who climbed to 612 feet to set gilded panels against an open sky, was taken down in pieces, cataloged in no inventory, claimed by no institution, and lost as completely as if it had never been raised. Singer Manufacturing Company continued operations for decades after the tower's demolition, eventually filing for bankruptcy in 2004. The sewing machines it made in the millions are now antiques, found in rural attics, estate sales, collectors' workshops, and museum display cases across 30 countries. They run still, many of them. The cast-iron treadle bases that once occupied the parlors of American households have outlasted the corporation that produced them, and the tower built to celebrate that production. The machine Singer built to thread a needle through domestic fabric has proved more durable than the monument Singer built to thread itself into civic permanence. The domestic object survived the imperial gesture. The humble tool outlasted the monument. What this suggests about ambition is both obvious and inexhaustible. We build monuments to announce permanence and discover that the announcement is the only permanent part. The intention, fixed in the historical record, survives long after the structure intended to embody it. Bourne believed the tower would be his truest legacy. Flagg believed his design argued for a better city. Singer's executives believed the lantern would be visible from the harbor for centuries. All three were wrong about the vehicle and right about the impulse. The impulse? To build upward, to mark the sky, to say we were here and our work meant something. That impulse does not expire. It simply finds new materials, new heights, new crowns to gild and raise and, in time, remove. Singer built a needle pointing skyward. Like all needles, it was made to pass through, not remain. What it passed through was time, briefly, brilliantly, and then completely. We do not mourn buildings. We mourn the certainty that made them seem permanent. The site at 149 Broadway carries no marker. One Liberty Plaza rises there in matte steel and reflective glass, absorbing rather than defining the light around it. The sidewalk below offers no indication that something once stood here briefly as the tallest inhabited structure on Earth, that iron workers climbed to 612 feet to set gilded panels against an open sky, that a man named Bourne gazed upward at a crown and believed it represented something permanent about himself and the industrial empire that had made him. Pedestrians move through the financial district without looking up. The harbor is still visible from rooftops nearby on clear days, though no lantern crown interrupts the sightline anymore. What remains is held in folders and flat files, Flagg's ink elevations, photographic negatives in acid-free sleeves, a dedication notice in the New York Times archive, dated May 1st, 1908, using the phrase monument to American industrial genius. These are the building's bones now, not calcium and iron, but paper and silver, filed in climate-controlled rooms, pulled occasionally by researchers who sit at reading room tables and study what was raised and taken down within a single human lifetime. Somewhere in the world, in an attic or a barn or a collector's workshop, a Singer sewing machine threads a needle with the same mechanical precision it demonstrated in 1908. Its cast iron frame is cold and heavy and indifferent to history. It does not know it outlasted the tower built to celebrate its manufacture. It does not know the crown that was gilded to announce its empire is gone without a fragment preserved. It simply holds thread, and when engaged, it stitches. Forward, then back, then forward, producing a seam that holds two pieces of fabric together against ordinary force.